So why is everyone so obsessed with Chuck E. Cheese? Yeah, it's entertaining. They have good pizza. Yeah. But still, why is everybody so obsessed? This is part two of my story of the infighting within the different rival mobs. Remember our main character, Don Gatti, also known as the dumbest Don, and his mob called the Gamble mob. When we left off our story, we were talking about how after the demise of the leader of the toilet paper gang, Chuckle Cheese, there were a lot of questions being asked. And people just couldn't leave it alone. Like it just kept going and going and going. Like people just kept talking about it. And it was mostly the young bucks, right, talking about it. But it wasn't just one group of young bucks. It was all the young bucks. It was the young bucks from the toilet paper gang who were asking questions about what happened to their leader. It was the young bucks from Nikki's gang. It was the young bucks from the Blue Knife side. A lot of people were asking questions. And then even some people who weren't young bucks, who were kind of well-known leaders, who were kind of more lower ranking members of the Gamble mob, but they were important people, like Candy and Tuck. And so a question that some people have is, why is everyone so obsessed with talking about this person? Why is everyone so obsessed with Chuck E. Cheese? I mean, there's lots of different pizza parlors, right? There's lots of different gangs. Mix a bunch of my metaphors right about now, so I hope you're keeping up. This is a story, just a story, not the news. Okay, so what started as a turf war between two rival mobs, right? The Gamble mob, led by Don Giotti, and the Blue Knife mob, led by Monica Marvel, who then disappeared. And that was the original turf war, right? But the Gamble mob took over the territory by cheating. They didn't play according to the rules of honorable gentlemen of mobster families, but they got the territory anyway. And then all of a sudden, they felt threatened by Chuck E. Cheese, who was the leader of a smaller mob, which they thought was in an alliance with them. So, there's this big mob, the Gamble mob, and then there's smaller mobs like Nikki's mob and Chuckie's mob, and they were all supposedly on the same page with kind of the same general goals and in charge of the same general territory. But then a hit was put out on Chuckie, and that changed everything. And it changed everything because everything is connected. So after he passed, the Gamble gang had this narrative they were trying to put forward that, oh, the rival Blue Knives did it. Those bad guys over there did it. They'd hurt one of our own. We love this man. He's our hero. And we're going to do all of these special ceremonies for him because he's our hero. But then all of these young bucks who were just curious by nature and also some of them very grief-stricken by losing their fearless leader, just began to do some of their own sleuthing. And, there are certain platforms, social platforms that make it easy for people to share their sleuthing data. And so lots of sleuthing data got saved and shared, having to do with trajectories and sound and footage and angles and possibilities, types of injuries. A lot of veterans weighed in. A lot of young bucks who just like to shoot guns and go hunting. Everybody had an opinion. And unfortunately, everybody had almost the same opinion. And that opinion was that the official story that Don Giotti's gang put out about what happened to this young buck just wasn't true. And to the surprise of many, this was something that people just could not let go of. They just wouldn't stop talking about this for days and days. It turned into weeks that people were just obsessed with this question of who put out the hit on Chuck E. Cheese. And so instead of the result being that all of these kind of smaller mobs would join in with the big Gamble gang and just make them into a bigger organization, instead of that happening, there continued to be fighting and infighting and fracturing and questioning and doubting and suspicion. And the people on the Blue Knife side were mostly just kind of watching and waiting like, oh, okay, fight amongst yourselves. But the Blue Knives were also busy with another project, and that was that they were working on getting that dossier released. And all of these sleuths doing all this sleuthing found out that these issues might be related. At the same time that these two mobs were fighting, there was also a group of people who had come together to go on a boat parade to a distant land to try to help people who were hungry. And it turned out that that too was related to the hit, or so some people said. For there were lots of wild theories being circulated about exactly who put the hit out on the young buck of the toilet paper gang and why. And one theory was that it was just obviously Don Quixote's gang because this was a gang that was challenging their authority. But how, people asked, how were they challenging their authority? And it turns out that this young buck, Chuckie, was challenging their authority on two issues. One, he was refusing to stop talking about the dossier, the folders. And number two, he didn't quite agree with Don Quixote about the land of milk and honey. He was starting to question whether he should maintain his allegiance to that distant land. And so all these young bucks who are sleuthing and investigating this hit are starting to see all of these connections. They're starting to see that, wow, there seems to be some link between these three issues. And this is really fascinating. There's nothing more exciting than a new conspiracy theory. But what all of these people and these various gangs involved in all these turf wars didn't see was the bigger picture. The people who saw the bigger picture were the crystal gazers and the stargazers, where they had been looking at the big picture from the beginning. And what they saw was that all of this apparent fighting among rival gangs and turf wars was actually helping everybody to wake up and begin to see past these territories, past these turf wars, past these mobs, these families, these gangs. People were beginning to wake up and question their allegiances to certain crime families. Do I really want to wear red or blue? Maybe I want to wear purple, some people said. Maybe none of these crime families have my best interests at heart. Maybe I also want that dossier released, and I also want those starving people fed. And I don't understand why these mobs don't want that. And I'm starting to feel like I have more in common with people who belong to other mobs than I do with the seniors in my own mob. And all of these young bucks began to look at each other across the distance from one family to another and say, maybe I have more in common with them than I do with my leadership. Maybe I don't even want to belong to either of these mobs. Maybe I just want to be a free agent. Maybe they're not really looking out for me the way I thought they were. I mean, on the one side, you had their leader, Monica Marvel, who was just removed from the leadership position. And on the other side, you had their leader who was just removed permanently from leadership by being pew-pewed. And so people had questions and people had concerns and people had theories. And people were beginning to think about things a little bit differently. But there's no rest for the weary, and so while people were asking questions and coming up with theories, Don Quixote's mob was like moving on to the next project. And so they decided to bring in all their mob bosses from every district in the city and have a big meeting with them because they were planning some major something. Nobody quite knew what, but it didn't seem to bode well. Because typically the only time a family would bring in every mob boss to one meeting in one place is when they are planning something big, usually a large assault against a rival. Stay tuned for the next chapter of this story. If you have questions, put them in the comments. Also, who do you think pew-pewed Chuck E. Cheese? And why do you think we're so obsessed?